Okay. One consequence of not using Google Meet or something is that I can't tell if anyone's watching. But I'm going to just assume you're all watching and get started. Alright, hey, today I wanted to talk about Monte Carlo simulation to combine probability distributions. And if that sounds boring, it's totally not. I'll explain more. The plan is to make this really practical, and in fact so accessible that you start using it all the time, even if you don't write any code. So all of the examples will be done in Google Sheets, but of course you can do it wherever. I just wanted to make it accessible. In a way, this is a continuation of my last pit talk about making the most of information using probability theory. Though in a strange way, this one will be both more quantitative and yet maybe more frequently useful in your lives. Let's warm up with what a probability distribution is at an intuitive level. So if you already know, I hope I'm going to give you a better intuition for it. Come with me down here. Cool. This is a probability distribution. It's spelled P-L-A-Y-D-O-H, probability distribution. And these are possible outcomes. So, I don't know, if we're talking about the presidential election, maybe it would be Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and then, you know, if something horrible happens, Kamala Harris. I wrote this talk and intended to give it just shortly after the election, so all of my examples may be a bit dated. If you think these are the mutually exclusive possibilities with any level of plausibility at all, then your job as a seeker after truth is to distribute your probability distribution, your lump of Play-Doh, proportional to your confidence. Why would you do that? We'll come back to that, but in short, better risk analysis, better decisions, better payoff on the bets you make every day of your lives. Crucially, you can never get any more clay, so that's why I'm using Play-Doh. You can't get any more of it. This is the sum total you will ever have for this particular question. So imagine it is a week after Election Day, when I was working on this talk, and you think there's a 94.03% chance Joe Biden will be our next president. Just a minute, let me pinch off exactly 94.03%. All right, cool. A 5.86% chance that Donald Trump will be our next president, and a 0.11% chance that Kamala Harris will be our next president. In that case, we divide our probability amass among these three possibilities. So you can never get any more clay to hand out on this question. So if for some reason a fourth option starts looking at all plausible, and we want to assign some probability mass to it, we have to take it from the other options. And if one of our possible outcomes starts looking more likely, we are forced to believe that the others are now less likely, on penalty of incoherence. So, I don't know, if a week after the election, former President Trump was caught on video flying and shooting lasers from his eyes, I would have revised my probability assignment that he had retained the presidency up, and in so doing I would also be forced to revise my probability assignments for Biden and Harris down on pain of incoherence. So if that happened, this guy flying and shooting lasers from his eyes would probably change my probability distribution quite a bit, and notice it has to come from the other options. Okay, but we live in the present, so we're here. Okay, the point is, there is a fixed amount of probability mass to distribute among possible outcomes. That's what a probability distribution is. I say distribution, you should hear me pinching clay off and distributing it among the possibilities. If the possibilities aren't discrete like this, but rather continuous, then what we're talking about is taking your probability mass and spreading it out over the outcomes in a way that seems kind of reasonable to you. So, I don't know, if this was a timeline, this is 0, this is 5, and how about 6? And if this is a 6-sided die, then it's actually got even probability. So you would want to make yourself a uniform probability mass. See, perfectly uniform in every way. Okay, last thing before we really begin is a bit of vocabulary. Once you've distributed your clay among the possibilities, you can sample from your distribution by asking it to give you some randomly chosen outcome proportional to how much probability mass you assigned. So if you've got a distribution like this, and you sample from it, not only is there a 94.03% chance, not only is 94.03% of your Play-Doh on Joe Biden, there's also a 94.03% chance the sampling operation will say Biden, will shout his name. I hope that distinction made sense. So you distribute your probability mass proportional to your confidence, but then the sampling operation uses how much probability mass is on each outcome to decide which outcome it's going to give you with some probability. We could still get Donald Trump with this probability assignment, it's just less likely to come up in the sampling operation. Probabilities are fixed amounts of clay. Once you've done your allocation, you can get your computer to sample from it. Okay, now to the actual point of the talk. Before and during the Manhattan Project, the legendary Enrico Fermi invented and used probabilistic techniques to study essentially deterministic questions, which were too difficult for deterministic methods. Later, when the Maniac computer was installed at Los Alamos, their usefulness exploded, the usefulness of these methods exploded, and one colleague suggested they be called Monte Carlo methods after a famous casino and this other colleague's gambling uncle. So now, it's the umbrella term for algorithms that gamble with accuracy in order to blow past intractability barriers using computers. So if you have something you want to work out, but you can't do it analytically with math, either because that math hasn't been discovered yet, or you're just not very good at math, don't panic. You have this wonderful device called the computer, and your computer might be able to work it out by throwing 10 million darts at an oddly shaped dartboard. So, let's look at a goofy but straightforward example. I will switch to the screen here. Cool. In Dungeons and Dragons, actually I wanted everything to lie. Okay. In Dungeons and Dragons, when you attack a monster, Dungeons and Dragons is a role-playing game. It's really fun. You should play with me sometime. If you attack a monster in Dungeons and Dragons, what you're actually doing in real life is you roll a 20-sided die. So like your normal dice are 6-sided, but D&D uses lots of different sides of die. If you roll a 20-sided die like this, except I couldn't find my D&D dice, so imagine it. I just rolled. Look, I got a 16. Nice. You roll a 20-sided die, add a particular number representing your weapon, and weapons that are more likely to hit have, a higher number associated with them. But anyway, roll a 20-sided die, add a number associated with your weapon, and then you hope that the resulting sum is higher than the monster's defense, which is also a number. If it's higher, you hit the monster. Great. And you roll more dice and add more numbers for the damage. However, if that attack roll comes up exactly 20, here, I'm doing it right now. I rolled, oh my gosh, look at that, a 20. What are the chances? So if that attack roll comes up exactly 20, it's called a critical hit. And the book says you get to roll your damage dice twice and add it all together. So you don't exactly get twice the damage you would have gotten, you just get more dice to add into it. Okay, but that can be a lot of dice to roll, especially in some games when the damage you're doing involves tons of dice already. So some game masters will let you just roll the usual number of dice. So if it was 4 d6s, that is 4 6-sided dice, before, instead of rolling 8, some game masters will just let you roll the usual number of dice and multiply by 2. That just goes faster. So my question is, and I'm sure you can imagine many questions like this, are you likely to do more damage that way or less than if you followed the book and rolled all the dice twice. So let's dwell on that question for a minute. As our first quantitative example, you just got a critical hit. So you just rolled a d20, it came up 20. You would normally roll 4d6, and I was going to do it. So here's my d6. Oh, look, I got a 3. And then I rolled again. Oh, there's a 4. So now I'm at 7 total. Then I just rolled again, and I... 4, 3, how about 2, and 5. Okay, I just rolled a 6-sided die 4 times. Cool. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I got 14 total. Yay. Because, yeah, that would be my damage. Except that I got a critical hit, so I would roll 4 more dice. Right. So on the one hand, I would roll the 8d6. And with the house rules we've been discussing, I would just take this number that I got, 14, and multiply by 2. Alright, so how do these two procedures affect the game? Under which rules are you a more powerful wizard? Now, I can solve this. The problem is still simple enough that you could work it out with combinatorics, or perhaps you know some trivia about combining uniform probability distributions. But math is hard, and computers are fast, so let's just roll 1,000 dice and see what happens. So here's the Monte Carlo simulation version of that instead. So here I've just asked for, here's one of my dice, here's another of my dice, here's another of my dice, another of my dice, and the little formula in here is just rand between. I want a random number between 1 and 6, and that's the formula for all of these. So I'm rolling 4 6-sided dice independently. And then these are exactly the same thing. So I have 4 over here and 4 over here, and then I add them up. So in the 8d6 case, I'm adding up everything from the A column here to the H column over here. So I'm adding up 4 of these dice. Over here, I am only adding up A through D, the first 4, and then I'm multiplying by 2. Okay. And now we can do what you do in spreadsheets and drag this down to the bottom. I'm doing that now, if you can't tell from the video. Google Sheets by default lets you have 1,000 of these. There's no doubt a faster way to get this, but this is what you're going to sit through. I'm going to use the other touchpad later, it'll help. Okay, we're at 1,000. Let the mouse go. Rolls a bunch of dice. Great. Not something you could probably actually do in real life with your normal human hands, but your computer can do it with its magical virtual hands. Okay, so then we're going to do this like a cooking show. Kerblam! I've rolled those dice and... there, cool. I rolled those dice, and let me go back to the less complicated spreadsheet real quick. I get a outcome of my simulation each time, because each one of these has the formula for that particular run in it. So this 36 here is the sum of all 8 of these dice, and this 34 over here is the sum of these 4, and then times 2. And then we just do that very, very, very many times. So now we can ask questions about these outcomes and get a feel for their statistics. So if I jump over here, I've already done that. I took the mean, so look at the formula here, it's just the average of everything in the J column that's numeric, so it doesn't take my heading here, but this is finding the mean of all of the 8d6 rolls. So these 999 numbers here, we take the mean, we get 27.9 in this particular case. I also did the standard deviation, and I did the min, and I did the max. And the same thing for the 4d6 column. I took the mean, the standard deviation, the min, and the max. And then I did something kind of like summary. Is it often the case that the 46 times 2 mean is greater than the 8d6 mean? So where I'm taking their their means and just seeing if one is bigger than the other. And in this case, it was true, but by how much? So this one is just subtracting them. Okay, and it seems that not that much. If you press backspace on one of these cells, it'll re-roll all your dice, and you can see that in a lot of cases it's true, some cases it's false, but this number is always really small, the difference is really small. So you don't, on average, end up doing more damage by doing the 46 times 2. However, notice something else from our statistics here. The minimum of 46 is often lower, and the maximum is often higher. And another way of saying that is the spread reflected in the standard deviation. The spread is higher in 46 times 2. So I can rerun this a couple more times by pressing escape, and it's almost always the case that the min of the 46 roll times 2 is lower and the max is higher. And you can also sort of see that in the distribution here. So that's something you might have missed. Their means are nearly the same, but the distribution is more spread out for the 46 over a wider range. So what that translates to in English is that you get more extreme results with 46 times 2. Same mean, they average out, so over the course of your game it shouldn't seemingly make too much of a difference, except for, boundedness. But that's not the point of this talk. We're out of scope. That would have been very easy to miss. So that distinction would have been very easy to miss without the full picture of the outcome distribution. So you can tackle a seemingly opaque problem with simulation. Great. So that example is maybe a bit obvious, that you can make your computer simulate something for you that you could, in principle, have done yourself. You could get together, 1,000 of your closest friends and had each of them roll a bunch of dice. It's very cool that you can have your computer do it for you during the pandemic. You don't have to have 1,000 friends in your house, but it's also a pretty straightforward thing. It may surprise you to hear that it is equally valid to use these kinds of simulations in cases where there's no randomness involved, only your own uncertainty. My last talk was all about the implications of the fact that the math of probability for random events corresponds exactly and uniquely to an extension of true-false logic, where you have uncertainty but no randomness at all. That correspondence means we can work backwards and get answers to uncertainty questions by pretending that we can rerun the universe multiple times. This correspondence between uncertainty on the one hand and randomness on the other is as deep and profound as they come. So, here's another example, a risk management example with no randomness, just uncertainty. Say you are a manufacturer, considering leasing a machine for part of your... You're a manufacturer considering leasing a machine for part of your production process. You produce widgets, you produce units. This machine is a whopping $400,000 a year, paid annually with no early cancellation. The machine is fancy and newfangled though, and you expect it might save you money overall. Maybe, probably. Let's break that down. You get your internal experts at your company to put a 90% confidence interval on some important metrics. Maintenance savings from having this machine, so maintenance savings, labor savings from having this machine, and raw materials savings. That is, your experts are coming up with a range for each of these three kinds of savings that they're 90% confident contains the true value. Whatever this machine is going to save you in labor, it's between this, and we're 90% confident about the this and the this. Okay, hold on to that thought, because as an aside, apparently about 95% of human beings are capable of accurate calibration, meaning that we could train you in about an afternoon to produce an accurate probability estimate, in the sense that if you say something is 90% likely, it ends up happening about 90% of the time. If you say 60% likely, it ends up happening around 60% of the time. This would be mostly a matter of teaching you what 90% certainty feels like, what 60% certainty feels like, as well as some tricks for avoiding common human biases that screw up numerical estimations, we might all get calibrated sometime for fun and profit. It is profitable. But I digress. Let's assume these experts have been calibrated, and so each of their 90% confidence intervals really are 90% likely to contain the true values. Okay, spreadsheet time. Back in our example, you ask your experts, and they say that for each widget you produce, they expect the maintenance cost on each widget to go down somewhere between $10 and $20 a unit. And so in the spreadsheet, I've got the MS maintenance cost, 90% confidence interval low is 10, and high is 20. So their maintenance cost savings, they think it's between 10 and 20. They also expect to save on labor costs, LS, somewhere between -$2 and $8 a unit. So note the negative lower bound there, because there's a chance the machine might end up increasing labor costs. Maybe it's hard to use. They need to pay people more to mess with it. The experts, so -2 and 8, the experts estimate the raw materials savings, the machine is way more efficient, to be between $3 and $9 a unit per, $3 and $9 a unit. Okay, those are the expert 90% confidence intervals, 10 to 20, -2 to 8, and 3 to 9. We also know from past years that our yearly production level is 15,000 to 35,000 units per year, and I've written that down here, PL, production level, 15,000 to 35,000 units per year. And as I mentioned, the lease on that machine is $400,000 per year. So we're interested in the question first of whether we break even if we buy the machine. And if we do better, then that helps. Total annual savings is easy to compute, right? Because you take your annual saving, you can see this, right? I think so. Your annual savings, and that's just going to be the sum of all of the various savings. So your main savings plus your labor savings plus your raw materials savings, and then you multiply that by your production level. Can you see that? Yeah, I hope you can see that. If you can't see that, I'm gonna click. Never mind. No, you can see that. So, because you're saving yourself this much money per unit, and you're saving this much money per unit. So if you just add them all together and multiply by the production level, that's your annual savings from having this machine. So let's get a first quick estimate. If we take the midpoint of each of these ranges that our experts gave us, then we get $15 a unit, so 15 is halfway between 10 and 20. We get $15 a unit, $3 a unit, $6 a unit, and 25,000 units per year. For an annual savings of 15 plus 3 plus 6 times 25,000. And that ends up being $600,000 a year. So $600,000 a year is greater than $400,000 a year. So it looks like the machine pays for itself with $200,000 in savings left over. And this cell in the spreadsheet, let me just go through this real quick. I said we're taking the midpoint. This is what a midpoint is. You know, you add the two numbers and then you divide by 2. So here's the midpoint of the material savings, low and high, divided by 2. The labor savings, low and high, divided by 2. The I keep thinking root mean squared. The raw material savings, low and high, divided by 2. Okay, and then we add those all together and we multiply by the midpoint of the production level. So nothing mysterious or scary here, except that maybe you don't know how to use spreadsheet. And then I'm subtracting $400,000 a year to make this our total savings. It's not really our total annual savings. Our total annual savings was $600,000 a year, but I'm subtracting $400,000 to show us how much over the break-even point we got. So we're essentially making ourselves $200,000 extra a year if we buy this machine. But that's only if the actual material savings, labor savings, root mean squared, and production level are at their midpoints. So there's some uncertainty. We would much prefer to know the actual probabilities of breaking even or not. So we can get that. To get that, though, we need one more thing. Those ranges by themselves are not probability distributions. I can lump my Play-Doh over a given range in many different shapes. So in addition to each range, we need the distribution shape. So for example, that maintenance cost savings that our expert said was between $10 and $20 a unit, is that equally likely to be any number between 10 and 20? If it was, that would be a uniform distribution. That's its shape. Or is there some central value that's most likely, like $15 in there, with less and less probability on numbers higher and higher, higher and lower than it as you move towards either extreme? That would be more like the normal distribution, aka the Gaussian distribution or bell curve, where the probability falls off pretty quickly as you go away from some central value. Those are two possibilities for a shape, and there are many other possibilities for a shape, each with a different purpose, and they're each good for modeling different things that happen in the real world, and we'll see more of them later. You can reason out what the shape is, or you can ask your experts what the shape is, and we can get a check later on how reasonable our assumptions have turned out to be. So it's not super essential that you get the right answer the first time. But if you know what each probability distribution is for, you can kind of figure it out. For now, let's say that all four of our variables are normally distributed around the midpoint of those ranges that we have. And we'll use the fact that these are 90% confidence intervals to finish fitting the normal distribution to the estimates. Okay, fitting here means taking the parameters we need for some distribution and hooking it up to our estimates. For a normal distribution, any normal distribution, the required parameters are mean and standard deviation. If you have the mean and standard deviation, you can draw the probability distribution. You've heard of those because the normal distribution comes up all the time. We just said we were going to make the mean the midpoint of the range, so we know that already for each variable in the equation. We can get the standard deviation from the definition of a 90% confidence interval, which is that we're 90% confident the true value falls within that interval. Or in other words, 90% of the probability mass is distributed between those two numbers of the range, the min and the max. So we just need to convert the 90% confidence range into standard deviations. It is a Googleable fact of every normal distribution that 90% of the probability mass lies within the center 3.29 standard deviations. We're going to use this fact to rescale our intervals into standard deviations, as if we were doing unit conversion, like miles to kilometers. But here, we're converting our range from a 90% confidence interval into standard deviations. So there are 3.29 standard deviations per 90% confidence interval. That's a fact I recommend you just memorize, 3.29. Because who the heck has any intuition for what a standard deviation is? But everyone at least feels like they have an intuitive sense of what it means to be 90% confident. And if we all get calibrated, that feeling will correspond to reality. Okay, so more spreadsheet time. Whoops. Alexa, turn the lights warm white. Okay, so what I just talked through, here's how you do it in Google Sheets. It's slightly different, I think, in Excel, but this norm inverse function in Google Sheets. Here, I just realized my face might be covering up that part of the spreadsheet. So, here, that's coming down. Okay, so the normal distribution inverse takes some just randomness between 0 and 1 and as its first parameter. You can ignore that for now. It's out of scope of this talk why the spreadsheet function uses that. But then this is the mean. As you can see here, this is the mean and this is the standard deviation. So we just need to give it a mean and standard deviation before it can give us samples from the normal distribution. So here's the mean. We saw this earlier. That's just the midpoint, right? That's the midpoint for materials savings. And then this one is the length of that range. So material savings high minus material savings low is how, like, the length of that range. And then if you divide by 3.29, you're doing the unit conversion to convert this into standard deviations. So really easy, if slightly obscure. And now we can get samples from it. So notice I did the same thing for the labor savings, the materials savings, and the production level. All of those are exactly the same function in here. I'm just pulling it from the different ranges that correspond. And then in the end, we just take that equation we discussed earlier, where we add up the 3 kinds of savings and we multiply by the production level, except that now these are each one of these is a sample from a normal distribution. And then I'm subtracting 400,000 again to see how much over the cost of the machine we are now making back. Okay, so if I do that, last thing. Last column is whether I broke even. There's an if function. If the annual savings is greater than 0, so like once you subtract the cost of the machine, if that's greater than 0, then we broke even. Great, you get a 1. Otherwise, you get a 0, and an F8 randomly in there. Okay. Fantastic. And now we're going to do the spreadsheet thing and get ourselves a gazillion samples of this. It's going to go a lot faster this time because this time I'm using my dictionary. Okay. Fool. Fool! You could have just held shift. On J. No, you couldn't have. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, you guys. This is not supposed to be the hard part, but my hands are sticky with Play-Doh. And so I can't drag this down. I'm going to just let it take its time, I think, this time. Okay, we're almost there. It is going faster. Oh my gosh. May that dictionary die. A horrible death. Might work anyway. Did it work? If this is the worst thing that happens in my talk, it will be great. Okay, you're going to sit through this one more time. Okay, wait. No, you don't have to do that. This is like a cooking show. Turns around and looks at his system. Okay, great. Ignore this for now. We're doing this like a cooking show. If I drag those down, I get a bunch of those samples. So that's just the point. I get more and more and more. Notice these are all exactly the same function because we're just drawing random numbers. It is super awesome and magical that just by drawing random numbers that, you know, have a certain shape, we're going to be able to get useful information out of them. Okay, notice that, you know, sometimes we don't break even, so things are working out. Every once in a while we get a 0, we didn't break even. And okay, so finally, we can actually check the probability of breaking even. And does that sound super complicated? Now that we've got these columns, we have a count of the number of samples, and we have the fact of whether or not we broke even for each one. So whether we broke even is just the sum of this column. You know, zeros don't count towards the sum, 1 does. Divided by the count, how many numeric values are in here. And check that out. We break even about 86% of the time in this particular sample. And if you rerun this, you'll get occasional different numbers, but they'll hover around that particular number. And if I had more samples, they would not change very much. I'm just going with the basic 1000 right now because the macOS dictionary is leaping into my way when I try to get more. But okay, so we just counted. We turned our really complicated sounding probability question into a count the number of ones in this column question. And we did it by, this was the hard part, modeling the uncertainty of each one of these variables. But that's a couple of tricks, like the standard deviation trick, plus a recognition of the fact that the normal distribution is likely pretty reasonable for physical objects in the physical universe a lot of the time. Okay, and then you can make yourself a histogram. I was going to make that in front of you, but I'll do that for one of the other ones. This is a histogram of this column, the total annual savings. So remember, I'm just computing this function over and over and over again for random samples, over and 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 over again. And then if I ask Google Sheets with like 5 clicks or something like that to make me this particular histogram, you can see how things are distributed across this range. The outcome, you can see, is a bell curve, so that's nice. The last negative number that they've got on a label here is down here, so the vast majority of the probability mass is on positive numbers. So you do make something from this machine most of the time. And of course we quantified that just a second ago with the 85%. Okay. Ponder with me for a moment. How did the randomness sneak in? Nothing in the problem itself had any randomness. It's entirely deterministic. When did we start using random numbers in our spreadsheet? You see, the deep correspondence between uncertainty and random sampling allows us to take information we have about the shape of our uncertainty and model it using the shape of a probability distribution. And then we can sample from the probability distribution, which allows us to run a simulation. Even though in the real world we cannot lease this machine 1,000 times and rerun the universe to see how it would go. And even if we did, well, never mind, we'll come back to that. But that's cool, right? We modeled the real universe with this little toy universe that has randomness in it, and then we sampled from our toy universe to get an answer that turns out to be comparable to the real universe and allows us to make decisions in the real universe. I took this example from a book called How to Measure Anything, which I highly recommend. So on the subject of just how powerful this is, let me quote that book directly. So, quote, "Our Monte Carlo simulation can be made as elaborate and realistic as we like. We can compute the benefits over several years with uncertain growth rates in demand, losing or gaining individual customers, and the possibility of new technology destroying demand. We can even model the entire factory floor, simulating orders coming in and jobs being assigned to machines. We can have inventory levels going up and down and model work stoppages if we run out of something, and we have to wait for the next delivery. We can model how the flow would change or stop if one machine broke down and jobs had to be reassigned or delayed." Unquote. And because I'm aware that I just made that sound fantastical and hard, let's go through one example of complicating our model a bit further. So say we're still wondering whether to lease this machine, but there's a major account we might lose. There's a 10% chance that Widgets R Us might decide to take their business elsewhere some month this year. And then our production levels would decrease by 1,000 units per month after that. And this would be a sudden change in a way a normal distribution can't model. So, are we doomed? We just need 2 more columns in our spreadsheet. First, we need a "did we lose the account" column, which we'll model with a binary or Bernoulli distribution, which is 1 with 10% probability and 0 with 90% probability, because we said there's a 10% chance we will lose this account. And you can get that really easily with the if in here. You just take random, which gives you a number between 0 and 1, and if that's less than 0.1, aka 10%, then this column will be 1, otherwise it will be 0. And then second, we need a how many months were left. How many months were left that year when we lost it column, which we'll model as a uniform distribution between 0 and 12. And you can get one of those maybe even easier, because we take the length of the range and we multiply it by some random number, and then somehow I added a 0 in there. That's slightly off. I think it's 0 and 11. 12 months. Anyway, I'm going to let that pass. It's almost right, if it's right. Wrong. Okay, so then our new production level, it just needs to be dependent on these two new columns. And so look at the new equation. It's exactly the same as the old one right here, where we're adding our 3 samples of the savings, and we're multiplying it by the production level, except now the production level can depend on some other stuff. Whether we lost the account is just 0 or 1, so we can multiply by that to decide if we lost the account or not. And then the number of months that were remaining helps to scale that up so that we can multiply by the 1,000 units a month we're losing and just subtract this whole big chunk that we just made from our production levels. And now we've got new production levels. Sweet. We're also going to, looks like I forgot to subtract the 400,000 from here. So we'll do that. And now I'm going to drag this down again. It's funny, I did not expect this to be the hard part. My hands were really dry yesterday. Oh, I failed. Failed. Shoot, I did it again. Alright, the cooking show thing, you should totally do that in your own talks. Okay, so I did make another version of this spreadsheet, so let me just show you that, where I've already dragged it down, except, actually that's not true. Okay, so I forgot to subtract the 400,000 in all of these, so I'm just going to solve that problem real quick by taking this number here and subtracting 400,000, and then this is one nice thing about Google Sheets. I don't need to drag it down if there's already a bunch of other things in the adjacent column. So, and now whether we broke even, the percentage of breaking even, well, that's just going to be counting these up again, except that I want to use this number that I just made, P. Shoot. No, I'm sorry, I can't do this on the fly. Okay, we're going to drag this down. It's going to work this time. All I have to do is not get impatient. Anyway, the actual modeling wasn't that hard. Just interacting with spreadsheets. Okay, we're 3/4 of the way there. Okay. So, now we can actually check. Turns out this screws us really bad. We break even now only 14% of the time. And that's bad. Turns out widgets RS is kind of important. And we can get a feel for the probability distribution here by making ourselves a little chart. And I highly recommend the little chart. It's really important to visualize things when you're doing data science of any kind. So, because you can fool yourself. We've got some fantastic examples of that. But so I just inserted a chart. If you go down here, this one is the histogram. You tell it what you want to histogram. So this N column, the annual savings, that's the one we want. And I can say, conveniently, NN to just get all the numerical values in there. Let's see. That's all I really need, although I tend to always put at least a title on them so that I don't forget what they are. So here's the distribution of annual savings based on the possibility of losing the account and our expert's estimation of the machine. You can see that a good pile of the the numbers down here. Did I just pick annual savings without the 400,000? I'm a little confused about that because the negative numbers don't seem to be quite as many as I expected. Well, anyway, when you're not in the middle of giving a talk, you can make yourself a chart and it'll give you way more information than if you just tried to snag the single point value number. Okay. Again, the actual modeling wasn't nearly as hard as it sounded, right? That's the point. Okay, so our new production level depends on samples from those distributions. It's whatever it was before, minus the 1,000 a month that we're going to lose whenever we lose this account, times how many months were left in the year. Ta-da! Yes. If the answer you get from simulation has an unacceptable variance, like turns out that too large of a number of possibilities will not break even, and or the spread is so large that although the mean looks okay, you don't you're not super confident, things could go really extremely and ruin your business. If you've got unacceptable variance like that, the model can tell you where you need to invest in measurements to reduce your uncertainty and get a better answer, because each component is itself a probability distribution. If it's a normal distribution, you can ask for its standard deviation to see how spread out, how confused you are about what the actual value is. And you can invest in some studies or something in your business and try and get that range tightened. Those 90% confidence intervals you started with, if you do some measurement, you might be able to narrow them. Remember that certainty, like 100% certainty, that's great. But you rarely ever have it. And any reduction in uncertainty is often all you need to make a better decision. Okay. Lastly, I lured you all here with election forecasting. So let's talk about how that's done. I strongly recommend that you read 538's explanation of how their model works for election forecasting, which may make more sense now to you that you've seen a simple model of a question composed of other probability distributions. What 538 tries to do with elections, as well as March Madness, is figure out how all sorts of information they can go look up contributes uncertainly to how people will vote in each state, and combine that into an overall probability distribution over the potential winners. It boils down to some keen insights about how things are correlated in between polls and economic conditions and stuff like that, captured with careful bookkeeping, the kind that we've just shown you on the spreadsheet, just careful bookkeeping, and a Monte Carlo simulation to combine them all into a single probability distribution. You can do that too! And there's a mountain of research in human decision-making showing that model-informed people consistently outperform intuition alone. So, should circumstances allow basketball by March, I'd really like to see you all try this kind of thing as you fill in your brackets. What's the probability that so-and-so is going to be injured and benched? And what's the probability that what's-his-name will get his stats up by March? And what's the probability that it'll contribute favorably to the game in that particular game? Etc., etc., etc. All of those things are a column in your spreadsheet modeled by some probability distribution. Anyway, I was talking about election forecasting. During the election, in addition to some of the more common sources of information, I was watching Eli Dorado's election map. This is a screenshot from election night. Dorado is an economist and former student here. Let me screen. There we go. Dorado is an economist and former student of Tyler Cohen's. This map is not based on any primary sources. It's not based on polls, voting trends, or economic conditions. It uses the API for Betfair.com, which is a prediction market which functions exactly like a gambling site for horse races, because it is a gambling site for horse races, except that what you're gambling on here is who will win each state. contracts are priced by their odds. That's just true in gambling in general. Odds translate to probabilities. The population of gamblers offer contracts to one another. I'm not here encouraging you to gamble, but rather to take advantage of the well-studied wisdom of crowds to summarize available information. Both Betfair and the Predictit prediction markets have free APIs. I don't even think Predictit requires you to make an account. So, before election night, the probability distributions, the map looked like this. Those two things on the bottom are two probability distributions over the number of electoral votes that Trump in red and Biden in blue would get, overlapped on one chart. People were offering each other relatively conservative odds at that point. It was still election night, but more people thought Biden would win in more states, and that's reflected in the fact that the majority of the blue probability mass here is generally higher than the majority of the red probability mass. These are the electoral votes on the bottom. I don't know if the font is too small for you to see that, but electoral votes, and so more to the right means likely to get more electoral votes. Each point on here is the probability of getting that number of electoral votes. So this is the outcome of an equation that adds up electoral votes. Okay, so blue was Biden's electoral votes, red was Trump. 2 days later, on the Thursday after, this looked like this instead. Now, it's really crucial to realize that because these are probability distributions, we didn't add or remove any Play-Doh. Desk. Each one of these is one of these guys. I was going to have red and blue Play-Doh. It was going to be awesome. But look, each one of these is a fixed amount of probability mass. So when we were looking at this one earlier, we had this much probability mass. And when we were looking at this one later, we still have this much probability mass. It's just squeezed into a smaller number of possibilities. So originally it looked like this, but then the later one is really, really squeezed and super tall just on a few particular numbers here. Okay, so we've only rearranged it over the electoral votes. These charts, I feel like these charts mess people up so often because it looks like there's less stuff in this chart. But really, look at the y-axis here. The probability here is 0.6 at the highest. Over here, the probability is somewhere between 0.01 and 0.015. That makes this one 50 times higher than the top of this one. So, if we were to take these blobs and put them on this chart, they'd be barely visible down here below. But we've squeezed them into now much more confident, much tighter probability distributions. Okay. So those two big spikes, by the way, are on 232 electoral votes for Trump, this one, big spike, and 306 electoral votes for Biden, which did end up being the final electoral count. Lastly, notice also that on Thursday, this chart, there were still a few significant other possibilities with some amount of probability mass. These ones here, these not so big spikes, but there were other significant possibilities corresponding to the probability that Trump or Biden would end up winning one state or another in an upset. Now, I've already shown you how to make one of these. If you've got an equation that can take you from who won each state to the final electoral count, you know how to compute not just the winner of the election, but by how many electoral votes, right? That's the deterministic equation. So if you already knew who won everything, you'd be able to compute who won the election, obviously, right? That equation is Googleable, of course, in the form of the table of how many electoral votes each state, and in some case subregions and factions and whatever, how many electoral votes they contribute to the overall count. And if there is any uncertainty, if you happen to live at a point in time when there is uncertainty about who will win a particular state, you can model it in your equation using random sampling. In this case, Eli Dorado used a prediction market to get the Trump or Biden probabilities for each group of electoral votes. Then he used a binary distribution between Trump and Biden for each state. So if Betfair's odds for, say, Georgia implied that there's a 60% probability Biden would win it and a 40% probability that Trump would win it, we give Georgia's electoral votes to Biden in 60% of the simulations and to Trump in 40% of the simulations by sampling. If you do that for all the states, add up the votes, and make a pretty chart, you win. Cool, right? That's pretty cool. And at some point, maybe I should talk explicitly about the wisdom of the crowds, but it's incredibly accurate. These kinds of things, prediction markets are incredibly accurate. They're also real-time updatable. This website would update every 2 minutes, I think, rerun the Monte Carlo simulation and give you a new probability mass adjustment. Very, very powerful tool for anything that you care about. Especially things that you care about that a lot of other people care about, and so they're willing to go and bet on it in the particular prediction market, but there are other ways to get probabilities if you want. Okay, so it's time to wrap up. So here's how I would boil it down into steps. The 7 steps of a Monte Carlo simulation. And I think I put this in the spreadsheet. You're not expected to be able to read this, but I'm going to give you the spreadsheet later, so you'll have these available to you. I'm just going to read them now. First step. Step 1, the equation. How would you compute the answer to this thing if there wasn't any uncertainty at all? If you just knew all of the variables, or at least all of the most important ones, how could you compute the answer you're looking for? Step 2, calibrated estimates. Get a calibrated estimate from somebody on the ranges of values each of those variables can take. It might as well always be a 90% confidence interval, because, I don't know, we know what that means. And if you can't get a calibrated estimate, get it uncalibrated. I don't know. Do the best you can. And if you're uncertain, make sure that that's reflected in your range. When you get your estimates, they should be pretty fuzzy if they're pretty fuzzy. That's a sort of cheap way to get some calibration. But ask yourself questions about it. We'll go over calibration at some point. It's really cool. Step 3, to model or not to model. At this point, you might actually be done already, because if you're 90% confident that your values fall in those ranges, you can get the minimum and maximum values of the answer you care about already just by plugging the minimums and the maximums into the equation. It might already be acceptable for your purposes. Like with that machine example, if all you cared about was breaking even and your minimum annual total savings was still positive, you'd be done. You could just stop right then. Step 4, model all uncertain variables. If you made it to this point, this step, it means you care about the actual probability distribution of the answer. Perhaps because you need the actual probabilities, or because you need to see if there are multiple peaks, perhaps, that happens, or something else. So to go farther, you need more than the confidence intervals. You need distribution shapes. Figure out which ones make the most sense for each one of your variables, and fit it to your calibrated confidence intervals. Step 5, sample and compute. Sample your component distributions. So stick it in a spreadsheet, use the distribution sampling equations that the spreadsheet gives you. They get super fancy. But, the vast majority of the time you want a normal distribution, a uniform distribution, a binary distribution. If you're going to model like things incoming, you want a Poisson distribution. You can Google that. But once you've plugged it into your spreadsheet, you just sample. Sample your component distributions and plug the outcomes, the values you get, into your equation to get an outcome for that particular simulation. Rerun this simulation many, many, many times by clicking the thing and dragging the spreadsheet to the bottom and being patient enough to let it down without pushing really hard on your touchpad. Figure out which one makes... sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. Rerun this simulation many times. Thousands of times. More times than I did just here. This was just an example. I'd do it at least 10,000 times. There is no rule of thumb. There's some really complicated reasons why... ways to figure out how many you might need. But your computers are really fast, so just do a lot. Do like 1 million if you can handle it. Do 2 million, do 5 million. But 10,000 is probably pretty okay for this kind of thing, where the combinations are simple, the probability distributions happen to be the same. things like that. But the more numbers, the better. And if you think your numbers are wonky, do more simulations. Okay, histogram. Step 6, make a histogram. Each outcome is the result of a particular way the world may turn out to be. A histogram will tell you how the probability mass is distributed over those outcomes. That is, how often a particular outcome actually happens. Okay, step 7. I haven't talked about this up until now, but step 7 is validate. You used several estimates here and there, and guessed at distributions. So it is prudent to collect some actual data from the real world to see if the distribution of the real data seems to match the statistics generated by the model. I hope that doesn't sound really hard. Like, getting some actual data means where you were sampling in your spreadsheet, go find some actual numbers. And then if you plug the actual numbers in to your model, instead of the sampled numbers, does the outcome make sense? Does it like fit? Does it look the same as your randomly generated model? It had better. If it doesn't, that gives you a hint about how you should debug your model. And if it does, it gives you some confidence that you modeled correctly. So I'm sure someone's question has got to be like, you're making stuff up all the time. How are we supposed to calculate, or how are we supposed to have any confidence in these models that you're making? Well, you compare them to data. Yeah. So if it's good, if it looks right, you're likely good to move ahead with using your model for IRL, in real life predictions. If not, you likely made a mistake or left out important factors. This serves as a good check of the accuracy of your model, and you should do it when you can. If you can't, then just be really careful at each step of the modeling process. Okay, that's mostly all. I like to think of sampling as rerunning a non-deterministic universe multiple times. You model the real deterministic universe, fight me, using a non-deterministic one, and then you sample your toy non-deterministic universe a lot to see what the spread is. Because of the deep correspondence between uncertainty and random sampling, the answer from your non-deterministic universe translates back to the real world. That's all I got. Thank you. Thank you for coming to my talk. I will now look at your questions, so don't leave yet. Kind of amazing that I can get spam in here already. Fantastic. Alright, now I'm looking at Slack. How does the number of sample random trials affect your probability of break even? It changes the spread when you rerun it multiple times. So obviously I'm taking random answers. This was John Cudd. If I had 10 million samples rather than 1,000 samples, then rerunning the spreadsheet would not give me much of a different answer. By the law of large numbers, it would tend to give me the same answer every time. But because of the randomness, it's possible that there's sampling error, like we don't always sample a nice, perfect, normal distribution from each one of our component distributions. It's like skewed and goofy, and if I go to one of these spots in the spreadsheet, we can see obviously that's not like a perfect bell curve, it's all jagged. And if I rerun a bit of it, we get a slightly different looking thing. It's vaguely the shape of a bell curve, and in this case I happen to pick the spreadsheet where it's not quite a bell curve, it's right skewed. But yeah, Justin wants to fight me. But if I used more numbers, it would look more right. It would look more bell curvy, more curvy. Yeah. Okay. How does the number of widgets produced affect break-even probability? Let's see, and then underneath there, how does the law of large numbers come into play when deciding on a value of the machine? Basically, if you had need for lower production numbers, how does that affect your probability of break even? Okay, so the number of widgets produced I sort of, it scales up both our profit and our savings. And profit's not modeled in here, so it's really just, it scales up our savings. More widgets produced gives us more savings per widget produced, because I think we're assuming we sell them all. And because we assume we sell them all here, a higher production level just gives you more savings. Deciding on the value of the machine. I'm not sure how to interpret your second question in that thread, John. How does the law of large numbers come into play when deciding on the value of the machine? It comes into play because we're saying, what I said before about taking more samples gives us more closer to the actual distribution of component outcomes in our model. Okay. If you had need for lower production numbers, that would affect your probability of breaking even by, I guess, narrowing the margins a bit. You'd have less savings because you're making fewer thingammies. So, yeah, it would likely change the probabilities. I'm not going to try and mess with the spreadsheet right now, but you could do that. You could mess with the spreadsheet, and I'm going to give you the spreadsheet. You can play around with it. Okay. What was the name of the book you recommended? Looked like somebody else. How to Measure Anything. Yeah, actually, I'm here. I've got a copy right here. I think this book should be How to Reduce Your Uncertainty About Anything. They made it all businessy because they wanted business people to read it, and business people should so read this book. But you should read it too if you're not a business person. Also, this guy offers classes on getting calibrated and stuff. We can getting calibrated is so much easier than it seems. You do trivia night basically, except that instead of saying that's the right answer, you say how confident you are that that's the right answer. And then you get feedback on that, and a couple hours is supposed to be like in an afternoon. You get feedback on that, and once you've gotten enough feedback, you get a feel for what it feels like to be that % certain about a thing. Yeah. Deterministic universe, fight me. Laugh. Ha 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 ha. Yes. I think I won't explain that now. Does anybody have any other questions? Stick them in the general channel right now if you have these other questions. I'll give you a few seconds. I'm going to assume there are no other questions, but I'll be here all week, guys. Thank you for coming to my talk. I really appreciate it. See you later. Stop streaming.